The acceptance letter to Institute Alpenrose arrived on a Tuesday morning, and I watched my stepmother Victoria's face light up with malicious satisfaction as she tore open the envelope. Her perfectly manicured fingers trembled slightly as she read aloud to my father, her voice dripping with false concern. "Oh, darling, they've accepted Elena into their program. It's exactly what we discussed. A strict boarding school in Switzerland that specializes in difficult children." She glanced at me with those cold blue eyes, the same ones that had watched me die in my previous life. "The tuition is quite steep, but I think it's worth every penny to give Elena the structure she so desperately needs." I sat at the breakfast table, fork halfway to my mouth, watching this performance with the clarity that only comes from having lived through betrayal once before. In my first life, I had begged and pleaded when they announced this decision. I had cried, promising to be better, to cause less trouble, to somehow earn the love that had been stolen from me the moment my father married this woman. But now, at 17 and reborn with 23 years of memories, I simply smiled. "When do I leave?" I asked, my voice steady and calm. Victoria's triumph faltered for just a moment. She had expected tears, protests, the usual dramatic scene that would let her play the long-suffering stepmother to my ungrateful stepdaughter. Instead, my composure seemed to unnerve her. "Next month," she said slowly. "The spring semester begins in February." "Perfect," I replied, taking another bite of my Eggs Benedict, a breakfast she only served when she was feeling particularly victorious. "I've always wanted to see the Alps." My father, Richard Hawthorne, looked up from his newspaper with the vague confusion of a man who had long since checked out of active parenting. "That's good, sweetheart. Very mature of you to take this so well. If only he knew how mature I truly was. If only he remembered the daughter he'd raised before Victoria's poison had slowly turned him against me. But that was the tragedy of my first life. Watching the man who had once called me his little star gradually transform into a stranger who barely noticed when his own daughter disappeared from his life forever. In my previous life, Institute Alpenrose had been my prison, and ultimately my grave. The isolation, the harsh discipline, the complete severing from everything familiar, it had broken me entirely. I had lasted 8 months before the combination of despair and the accident Victoria had arranged finally claimed my life on those treacherous mountain roads. But this time, I knew something Victoria didn't. I knew that Institute Alpenrose wasn't just any boarding school. I knew that behind its imposing gates and reputation for reforming troubled youth lay a secret that would destroy her completely. Most importantly, I knew that the school's enigmatic owner, referred to only as Der Direktor in all the official paperwork, was Heinrich Hawthorne, my father's estranged father and the grandfather I had never been allowed to meet. The old man had spent the last 15 years building Institute Alpenrose into an exclusive institution that catered to the children of the ultra-wealthy. What Victoria saw as a convenient dumping ground for an unwanted stepdaughter was actually one of the most expensive and prestigious schools in Europe, with a waiting list that included royalty and billionaires' children. But more than that, Heinrich Hawthorne had spent those same 15 years waiting for any sign that his son might reach out, that the damage done to their relationship might somehow be healed. He had no idea that Richard had remarried, no idea that he had a granddaughter, no idea that the same manipulation that had driven father and son apart was now being used to destroy the next generation. In my first life, I had been too broken by the time I discovered the truth to do anything about it. I had learned Heinrich's identity only in my final weeks. Too late to save myself. Too late to expose Victoria's web of lies. But I had seen the pain in the old man's eyes when he realized what had happened, had watched him blame himself for not knowing, not acting sooner. This time would be different, and this time I would let Victoria send me directly into the arms of the one person who had both the power and the motivation to destroy her completely. The weeks leading up to my departure passed in a strange bubble of anticipation. Victoria threw herself into preparations with the enthusiasm of someone planning a vacation, rather than sending a child away. She ordered new luggage, researched the school's dress code, and made endless phone calls to ensure everything was perfect for my exile. My father remained largely absent from these preparations, which wasn't surprising. Richard Hawthorne had mastered the art of being physically present while emotionally unavailable, a skill that had been carefully cultivated during his 5-year marriage to Victoria. When I had been younger in both lives, I had tried desperately to understand how the loving father I remembered from my early childhood had become this distant stranger. It had taken me years to realize that it hadn't been gradual at all. Victoria's influence had been subtle but systematic, like water wearing away stone. A comment here about how difficult I was becoming. A suggestion there that perhaps I needed more structure. She had painted herself as the concerned stepmother, trying to help a grieving widower raise his troubled daughter, all while slowly poisoning the relationship that threatened her control over him. My mother had died when I was 12, a sudden illness that had left both my father and me reeling. Victoria had appeared in our lives 6 months later, a beautiful widow with her own tragic story and an uncanny ability to anticipate exactly what a grieving man needed to hear. She had married my father within 18 months, and by the time I turned 14, I had become an obstacle to be managed, rather than a daughter to be loved. In my first life, I had never understood the full scope of her manipulation. I had seen only the surface, the coldness, the obvious favoritism she would have shown to her own children if she'd had any, the way she gradually convinced my father that I was becoming unmanageable. It wasn't until I was dying, alone in a Swiss hospital room, while she convinced my father I was too unstable for visits, that I had begun to piece together the larger picture. Victoria hadn't just wanted me gone. She had wanted me erased. Every photo of my mother that disappeared, every family tradition that was quietly discontinued, every connection to my father's past that was severed. It had all been part of a systematic campaign to rewrite our family history with herself as the central figure. But she had made one crucial mistake. In her eagerness to erase me, she had also erased any mention of Heinrich Hawthorne from our household. My father's estrangement from his own father had begun long before Victoria arrived, the result of some family conflict I had never fully understood. But Victoria had carefully maintained that separation, ensuring that there was no chance of reconciliation that might threaten her position. What she didn't know was that Heinrich had never stopped watching from afar. Through private investigators and carefully maintained connections, he had kept track of his son's life, always hoping for a chance to make amends. He knew about Richard's first marriage, knew about my mother's death, but the information always came years too late, and through such distant channels that acting on it felt impossible. He had no idea that Richard had remarried. He had no idea that his granddaughter existed. And he certainly had no idea that the prestigious institution he had built was about to become the stage for his family's reunion. I spent those weeks before departure carefully laying the groundwork for what was to come. Nothing too obvious. Victoria was cunning enough to spot an outright rebellion, but small things that would matter later. I made copies of important documents, including my mother's death certificate and the original custody papers that listed Heinrich as an emergency contact. I researched everything I could find about Institute Alpenrose and its mysterious owner, building a mental file of information that would prove useful. Most importantly, I began documenting Victoria's behavior with the patience of someone who knew exactly how the story would end. I recorded conversations where she spoke dismissively about my problems, saved emails where she discussed my need for intervention, and carefully preserved every piece of evidence that showed her true attitude toward me. In my first life, I had been a child fighting against an adult's machinations with nothing but emotion and desperation. This time, I would meet her manipulation with calculation, her cruelty with strategy. The night before my departure, Victoria hosted a small dinner party, her way of announcing to her social circle that she had successfully solved the problem of her difficult stepdaughter. I sat at the table, smiling politely as she explained to her friends how heartbroken she was to send me away, how she hoped the therapeutic environment would help me work through my issues. "It's really for the best," she said, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief that remained completely dry. "Helena has been struggling so much since her mother's death. We've tried everything, therapy, tutoring, even medication, but nothing seems to help. This school specializes in children who need more intensive support." Her friends made all the right sympathetic noises, praising her dedication to my well-being while shooting me pitying glances across the table. I played my part perfectly, the sullen teenager who was too ungrateful to appreciate her stepmother's sacrifices. I'm sure she'll come back a completely different person, Victoria continued, and for just a moment, her mask slipped enough to show the satisfaction underneath. Sometimes children need to be removed from their comfort zone to really grow. She had no idea how right she was, though not in the way she imagined. That night, I lay in my childhood bedroom for what I knew would be the last time, looking at the walls that held 17 years of memories. In a few hours, I would leave this house, and I would never return as the powerless child who had been sent away in disgrace. When I came back, and I would come back, it would be as Heinrich Hawthorne's granddaughter and heir, armed with the resources and connections to destroy everyone who had wronged me. But first, I had to survive the journey itself. I had to walk back into the place where I had died and somehow find the strength to face those memories while building something entirely new. As I drifted off to sleep, I thought about the letter Victoria had received accepting me into Institute Alpenrose. In my first life, I had assumed it was just another of her arrangements, another way to get rid of me while maintaining her image as the caring stepmother. Now I knew better. The letter had come so quickly after her application, because Heinrich Hawthorne never turned down a child who needed help, no matter how full his school was. He had built Institute Alpenrose not as a dumping ground for unwanted teenagers, but as a sanctuary for young people who had been failed by the adults in their lives. He just didn't know that this time, one of those children would be his own granddaughter. The flight to Zurich passed in a blur of anticipation and carefully suppressed memory. Victoria had insisted on accompanying me to the airport, playing the role of the heartbroken stepmother to perfection. She hugged me goodbye at the security checkpoint, whispering promises to call and visit that we both knew were lies. "Remember, darling," she said loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear, "this is all to help you heal. I know it's difficult now, but someday you'll understand that everything we've done has been out of love." I hugged her back, breathing in her expensive perfume one last time, memorizing the scent so I would never forget what deception smelled like. "I'll remember everything," I promised her, and the double meaning of those words made me smile. The school sent a car to meet me at the airport, a sleek black Mercedes that spoke of serious money and attention to detail. The driver was a middle-aged Swiss man named Klaus, who spoke perfect English with just a hint of an accent. He was polite but not chatty, which gave me time to prepare myself as we wound our way up into the mountains. Institute Alpenrose sat nestled in a valley between two peaks, its buildings constructed of warm wood and local stone that made it look like it had grown naturally from the mountainside. The main building was impressive but not ostentatious, designed to blend with the landscape rather than dominate it. Gardens and walking paths connected the various dormitories and academic buildings, and everything was maintained with the kind of precision that spoke of serious resources behind the operation. In my first life, I had seen only the prison aspects of the place, the high walls, the strict schedules, the sense of being cut off from the world. Now, with different eyes and the knowledge of what this place truly represented, I could see it for what it really was. A haven created by someone who understood what it meant to be lost and alone. The administrative office was located in the main building, its warm wood paneling and comfortable furniture designed to put nervous parents and students at ease. I was greeted by a woman in her 50s named Mrs. Weber, who served as the school's admissions coordinator. She had kind eyes and a genuine smile, and I could see immediately why parents would trust her with their children. "Miss Hawthorne," she said, consulting her clipboard, "welcome to Institute Alpenrose. I hope your journey wasn't too difficult." "Not at all," I replied. "The scenery was beautiful." She smiled approvingly. "Many of our students find the mountains very healing. There's something about being surrounded by such natural beauty that helps put things in perspective." If only she knew how much perspective I already had. Mrs. Weber walked me through the standard orientation process: dormitory assignment, class schedules, rules, and regulations. Institute Alpenrose operated on a modified version of the Swiss educational system, with small class sizes and intensive personal attention. Students ranged in age from 14 to 18, and many of them were there for reasons similar to mine: family conflicts, behavioral issues, or the need for a fresh start away from difficult circumstances. We find that many of our students thrive once they're given the chance to succeed in an environment that truly supports them, Mrs. Weber explained as we walked toward my dormitory. Dr. Heinrich, our director, has very strong feelings about giving young people the resources they need to overcome whatever challenges they've faced. My heart skipped a beat at the mention of his name, but I kept my expression neutral. He sounds very dedicated. Oh, he is. He takes a personal interest in every student who comes here. In fact, he likes to meet with each new arrival within their first week, just to make sure they're settling in well. She paused at the entrance to a beautiful building that overlooked the valley. This is Edelweiss House, where you'll be staying. Your roommate is a lovely girl named Sophie from Germany. I think you'll get along well. My room was on the 3rd floor with a window that provided a stunning view of the mountains. It was simply but elegantly furnished with 2 beds, 2 desks, and plenty of storage space. Sophie turned out to be a 16-year-old with curly brown hair and an infectious laugh who immediately made me feel welcome. "You're from America?" she asked, helping me unpack my suitcase. "How exciting! I've always wanted to visit New York." "It's not as glamorous as everyone thinks," I replied, which made her laugh. "That's what everyone says about everywhere they're from. I'm from Munich, and whenever anyone gets excited about Oktoberfest, I have to tell them it's mostly just drunk tourists and overpriced beer." I found myself genuinely smiling for the first time in weeks. In my first life, I had been too depressed and angry to connect with any of the other students. I had seen them as fellow prisoners rather than potential allies. But now, with the clarity that came from knowing this was all temporary, I could appreciate what this place really offered. A community of young people who had all faced their own challenges and were working to overcome them. Over the next few days, I threw myself into the rhythm of school life with an enthusiasm that would have shocked Victoria. I attended classes, participated in discussions, and even joined the photography club. My teachers were impressed by my academic performance, though they attributed it to my finally being in a supportive environment, rather than the reality that I was essentially repeating my senior year with 17 years of additional life experience. But beneath the surface, I was preparing for the moment I knew was coming. My meeting with Heinrich Hawthorne. It came exactly 1 week after my arrival. Mrs. Weber found me after dinner on Thursday evening, her usual smile brightened by excitement. "Miss Hawthorne, Dr. Heinrich would like to see you in his office tomorrow afternoon at 4 o'clock. It's just his usual check-in with new students. Nothing to worry about." I spent that night lying awake, staring at the ceiling and rehearsing what I would say. In my first life, I had met him only briefly, too broken and medicated to do more than mumble answers to his concerned questions. I had learned his identity through overheard conversations between staff members, pieced together the family connection through fragments of information that came too late to save me. This time, I would be ready. Heinrich Hawthorne's office was located on the top floor of the main building, with panoramic windows that offered a breathtaking view of the surrounding peaks. The room itself was warm and inviting, filled with books, family photographs, and artwork created by former students. It was the office of a man who had spent decades working with young people and genuinely cared about their well-being. He was standing by the window when I knocked, and when he turned to greet me, I felt the full impact of seeing him with clear eyes for the first time. Heinrich Hawthorne was 73 years old, with silver hair and the kind of dignified bearing that spoke of old money and older principles. But it was his eyes that caught my attention. The same deep brown eyes that I saw in the mirror every morning, the same eyes that my father had inherited and passed on to me. "Miss Hawthorne," he said, gesturing to a comfortable chair near his desk. "Please sit. I hope you've been settling in well." "Very well, thank you," I replied, my voice steady despite the emotional storm inside me. "Everyone has been incredibly kind." He smiled, and I saw my father in that expression, or rather, I saw the man my father had been before Victoria's influence changed him. "I'm glad to hear it. Your application was quite unusual, you know. Most of our American students come to us through educational consultants or word of mouth from other families. But your stepmother contacted us directly, which suggests she did quite a bit of research." "She's very thorough," I said carefully. "Indeed, she seemed quite concerned about your well-being in our phone conversations. She mentioned that you've been struggling since your mother's death. My condolences, by the way. Losing a parent at such a young age is never easy." There was something in his tone that made me look more closely at his expression. A flicker of pain, quickly suppressed, that suggested this wasn't just professional sympathy. "Thank you," I said. "It's been difficult." "And your father? How is he coping with everything?" The question caught me off guard. In my first life, Heinrich had never asked about my father during our brief interactions. But now I could see the careful control in his expression, the way he was trying to appear casual while asking something that clearly mattered deeply to him. I paused, choosing my words carefully. "He's been very focused on moving forward. Sometimes I think he prefers not to talk about the past." Something shifted in Heinrich's expression, a flicker of old pain that he quickly masked. "I see. Well, that's understandable, I suppose. Grief affects everyone differently." He cleared his throat and picked up a folder from his desk. "Now let's talk about your academic goals. Your transcripts show strong performance in most subjects, though there seems to have been some decline in your grades over the past year." We spent the next 30 minutes discussing my academic program and future plans. I answered his questions thoughtfully, showing the kind of maturity and insight that impressed him while being careful not to reveal too much too quickly. But throughout the conversation, I was watching his face, looking for the right moment to plant the seeds that would eventually grow into the truth. That moment came near the end of our meeting when he asked about my family background for the school's records. "Just for our files," he said apologetically. "We'd like to have emergency contact information beyond what's provided in the initial application. Are there any other family members we should be aware of? Grandparents, aunts, uncles?" I took a deep breath. This was it, the moment that would set everything in motion. "Actually," I said slowly, "that's complicated. My father doesn't really talk about his family. I know he had some kind of falling out with his father years ago, but he's never told me the details. My stepmother says it's better not to bring up painful memories." Heinrich had gone very still, his pen hovering over the paper without writing anything. "Your father's name is Richard?" he asked quietly. "Richard Hawthorne, yes. Do you know him?" For a long moment, Heinrich didn't answer. He was staring at me with an intensity that was both frightening and hopeful, as if he was seeing something that both thrilled and terrified him. "What did you say your father's full name was?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Richard Alexander Hawthorne," I replied. "He named me Elena Rose, after my grandmother Rose and my mother, Elena." The pen fell from Heinrich's fingers, clattering onto the desk. He was staring at me now with unconcealed shock, his face gone pale. "Your grandmother Rose," he repeated slowly. "My wife, my Rose." I felt tears prick at my eyes, genuine emotion breaking through my carefully maintained composure. "Then I started. "Your grandfather," he finished, his own voice thick with emotion. "Dear godchild, you're my granddaughter." The silence that followed was profound, filled with 17 years of missed opportunities and carefully maintained separation. Heinrich rose from his chair and walked back to the window, his hands clasped behind his back as he stared out at the mountains. "All this time," he said finally, "all these years, I've been hoping for some sign that Richard might, and you've been here all along." I stood as well, moving to join him at the window. "He doesn't know," I said softly. "My stepmother handled all the arrangements. She told him this was just a school for troubled teenagers, somewhere to send me while they figured out what to do with me." Heinrich turned to look at me, and I saw anger flash in his eyes. Not at me, but at the situation, at the years that had been stolen from us. "Troubled teenagers?" he repeated. "What exactly did she tell him about you?" And there it was, the opening I had been waiting for. The chance to plant the seeds of doubt that would eventually grow into the truth about Victoria's manipulation. "She thinks I'm difficult," I said carefully. "She's convinced my father that I've been acting out since my mother died, that I need more structure than they can provide at home. She's very good at making everything sound like it's for my own good." "And is it true? Have you been acting out?" I met his eyes steadily. "I think any teenager would struggle with watching their father remarry someone who clearly wishes they didn't exist." Heinrich's expression darkened. "She wishes you didn't exist. Not in so many words, she's too smart for that. But she spent the last 5 years systematically erasing every trace of my mother from our house, convincing my father that I'm too much trouble to deal with and positioning herself as the long-suffering stepmother who's trying her best with an impossible situation. I paused, letting that sink in before continuing. The truth is, I haven't been acting out at all. I've been trying desperately to hold on to some connection with my father while watching him slip further and further away from me. Sending me here was just the final step in getting me out of the picture completely. Heinrich was quiet for a long time, processing what I had told him. When he finally spoke, his voice was filled with a cold fury that reminded me powerfully of my father in his rare moments of real anger. How long has she been planning this? I think she's been planning it since the day she married him, I replied honestly. She's just been very patient about implementing her plan. And Richard has no idea that you're here? That you're with me? None at all. As far as he knows, I'm at some anonymous boarding school in Switzerland, working through my issues with the help of trained professionals. Heinrich turned away from the window and walked back to his desk. But instead of sitting down, he began pacing behind his chair. 17 years, he said, more to himself than to me. 17 years I've been waiting for some sign that he might be ready to reconcile. And all this time, he had a daughter, my granddaughter. What happened between you? I asked. Why did you stop talking? He stopped pacing and looked at me with surprise, as if he had forgotten that I wouldn't know the family history. It's a long story, he said finally, and not a particularly pleasant one. But I suppose you have a right to know. He gestured for me to sit back down, then settled into his own chair with the air of a man preparing to revisit painful memories. Your father and I were very close when he was young, he began. After your grandmother died, when Richard was 16, it was just the two of us for several years. I thought we understood each other, that we were managing our grief together. He paused, his fingers drumming against the desk. But when Richard went to university, he met a girl. Her name was Amanda Sterling, and she was a lot like your stepmother, from what you've just told me. Beautiful, charming, very good at telling people what they wanted to hear. I felt a chill of recognition. Richard was completely infatuated with her. He wanted to marry her the moment he graduated, start a family immediately. I tried to counsel patience. He was only 22, and there were some things about Amanda that concerned me. What kind of things? She had a pattern of relationships with wealthy men that ended badly, financial irregularities, stories that didn't quite add up about her background. Heinrich shook his head. I hired a private investigator to look into her history, thinking I was protecting my son from making a terrible mistake. I could see where this was going, and my heart sank. Richard found out about the investigation, Heinrich continued. He was furious, accused me of trying to control his life, of not trusting his judgment. We had a terrible fight, said things that can't be taken back. What happened to Amanda? She disappeared, literally, overnight. Took everything of value she could carry from Richard's apartment and vanished. Left him a note saying she couldn't handle the pressure from his family. Heinrich's voice was bitter. The private investigator found her a month later in Monaco, engaged to a French industrialist. And my father blamed you. Completely. He was convinced that I had somehow driven her away, that my interference had cost him the love of his life. He cut off all contact, moved across the country, changed his phone number. I tried for years to reach out, but he returned every letter unopened, refused every attempt at communication. The pieces were falling into place now, the full scope of the tragedy becoming clear. So when he met my mother, I never knew about it. By the time I learned he had married, you had already been born. I thought about trying to contact him then, but I was afraid it would just drive him further away. I told myself there would be time later that eventually he would want his daughter to know her grandfather. But then my mother died, and Victoria came along. And history repeated itself in a way. Except this time, there was no one to warn him about what she really was. We sat in silence for a moment, both of us contemplating the bitter irony of the situation. She doesn't know who you are, I said finally. Victoria has no idea that she just delivered your granddaughter directly into your hands. A slow smile spread across Heinrich's face, and for the first time since I had entered his office, he looked genuinely pleased. No, she doesn't, does she? She thinks she's gotten rid of you permanently, sent you somewhere you'll be forgotten and ignored. What are you going to do? Heinrich was quiet for a long moment, considering his options. That depends on you, Elena. What do you want to happen? It was the question I had been preparing for since the moment I decided to let Victoria send me here. I want my father back, I said simply. I want him to see what she really is and remember who he used to be before she got her claws into him. And I want her to pay for everything she's done. To me, to him, to our family. Heinrich nodded slowly. Those are reasonable goals, but it won't be easy. If she's as manipulative as you say, she'll have prepared for the possibility that someone might challenge her version of events. She has, I agreed. But she's made one crucial mistake. She's been so focused on erasing me from my father's life that she never considered the possibility that someone else might be watching, someone with the resources to fight back. You mean me? I mean us, I corrected. She sent me here thinking she was isolating me, cutting me off from any possibility of support or advocacy. Instead, she's given me access to exactly the ally I need to expose her for what she really is. Heinrich leaned back in his chair, a calculating look in his eyes that reminded me powerfully of my father when he was working through a complex business problem. Tell me everything, he said. Every detail of her manipulation, every instance of abuse or neglect. If we're going to do this, we need to do it right. And so I told him. I told him about the gradual erosion of my relationship with my father, the systematic removal of my mother's belongings, the careful campaign to paint me as a troubled teenager who needed professional intervention. I told him about the friends I had been forbidden to see, the activities I had been prevented from participating in, the thousand small cruelties that had been disguised as necessary discipline. I told him about finding my mother's jewelry missing from her room, about the college fund that had mysteriously become unavailable due to market conditions, about the way Victoria had convinced my father that I was becoming dangerous and needed to be removed from the situation for everyone's safety. And finally, I told him about my previous life. Not the supernatural aspects, but the emotional truth of what had happened. How the isolation and despair had broken me. How I had died alone and forgotten while she convinced my father that I was too unstable for visitors. Heinrich listened to all of it with growing anger, his jaw clenched and his hands gripped tightly on the arms of his chair. She killed you, he said when I finished. Maybe not with her own hands, but she killed you as surely as if she had pushed you off that mountain herself. Yes, I said simply, and she would have gotten away with it completely if I hadn't been given this second chance. Well, Heinrich said, rising from his chair with new purpose, she's not going to get away with it now. The next several weeks passed in a whirlwind of careful planning and strategic preparation. Heinrich approached the situation with the same methodical precision that had made him successful in business and in building Institut Alpenrose into one of Europe's premier educational institutions. The first step was documentation. We needed irrefutable proof of Victoria's manipulation and abuse, evidence that would stand up in court if necessary. Heinrich hired a team of private investigators to look into Victoria's background, her financial dealings, and her treatment of me. What they found was even worse than I had suspected. Victoria Sterling, that was her maiden name, though she had used several others over the years, had a pattern of targeting recently widowed men with significant assets. My father was actually her third such marriage, though the other two had ended in divorce rather than the complete destruction she was attempting with our family. Her first husband, a telecommunications executive from Chicago, had divorced her after 2 years when he discovered she had been systematically stealing from his business accounts. Her second husband, a real estate developer from Phoenix, had lasted slightly longer but had ultimately filed for divorce when he realized she was manipulating his relationship with his teenage son. In both cases, she had walked away with substantial settlements and excellent references, largely because both men had been too embarrassed by their own poor judgment to expose her publicly. But with my father, she had refined her approach. Instead of stealing outright, she had convinced him to make investments that happened to benefit her personally. Instead of openly antagonizing his child, she had presented herself as a concerned stepmother who was doing her best with a difficult situation. The investigators also uncovered something else. Victoria had been in contact with Institut Alpenrose for over a year before my mother's death, researching options for troubled teenagers, and gathering information about international boarding schools. She had been planning my exile from the moment she married my father, just waiting for the right opportunity to implement her plan. She's been playing a very long game, Heinrich said when we reviewed the investigator's report. But she's also been very careful to make sure she could retreat at any time if things went wrong. The problem is, she doesn't know that things have already gone wrong. Meanwhile, I continued my normal routine at school, attending classes and participating in activities while we built our case against Victoria. My teachers and fellow students saw only a young woman who was thriving in her new environment, finally free from whatever had been troubling her at home. In a way, it was true. Being at Institute Alpenrose, knowing that I had Heinrich's support and protection, had lifted a weight from my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. For the first time in years, I felt safe, but I also felt the pressure of time. Every day that passed was another day that Victoria had to consolidate her control over my father. Another day for her to notice that her plan wasn't working as expected. She called the school every few weeks, ostensibly to check on my progress, but really to make sure I was still safely contained. Heinrich took these calls personally, playing the role of the concerned educator while gathering information about her true motivations. She seems very interested in making sure you don't have contact with anyone from home, he reported after one such conversation. She specifically requested that we not allow you to call your father, saying it would be too upsetting for both of you during this adjustment period. Of course she has, I replied. The last thing she wants is for me to tell him what really happened, or for him to hear how I'm actually doing here. Speaking of which, Heinrich said, pulling out a folder thick with documents, I think it's time we gave your father a call. My heart jumped. Are you sure? What if she's monitoring his phone? Let her monitor it, Heinrich said with grim satisfaction. By the time she realizes what's happening, it will be too late for her to do anything about it. But first, Heinrich wanted to make sure we had every possible advantage. The investigators had provided us with detailed financial records showing how Victoria had been systematically draining my father's accounts, convincing him to invest in shell companies she controlled, and moving assets into accounts that would be difficult to trace. More damning still, they had uncovered communications between Victoria and a lawyer in the Cayman Islands about succession planning that made it clear she was preparing for my father's death. Not planning it necessarily, but certainly positioning herself to inherit everything when it happened naturally. She's not just trying to get rid of you, Heinrich explained as we reviewed the evidence. She's trying to ensure that when your father dies, there will be no one left to challenge her inheritance. No children, no family connections, no one who might question her version of events. Except now there is, I said. Except now there is, he agreed. We decided to make the call on a Friday afternoon when Victoria would likely be out at one of her charity luncheons and my father would be in his home office, alone and more likely to actually listen. Heinrich's private office had a conference phone with excellent sound quality, and he had arranged for the call to be recorded. Not for legal purposes, since the recording wouldn't be admissible in court, but so we would have a record of exactly what was said. I sat in the chair across from Heinrich's desk, my hands clenched in my lap. As he dialed the number I knew by heart. The phone rang 3 times before my father answered, his voice distracted and slightly impatient. Richard Hawthorne. Hello, Richard, Heinrich said quietly. This is your father. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. When my father finally spoke, his voice was tight with shock and something that might have been anger. How did you get this number? It's not difficult to find someone when you really want to, Heinrich replied. Though I wish the circumstances were different. What circumstances? What do you want? Heinrich glanced at me and I nodded encouragingly. I'm calling about your daughter, Richard, about Elena. Another silence, longer this time. What about Elena? How do you even know about Elena? Because she's here, son. She's been here for 3 weeks now, attending my school in Switzerland. I could hear my father's sharp intake of breath, the creak of his desk chair as he presumably sat down hard. That's impossible, he said finally. Elena is at a therapeutic boarding school. Victoria arranged everything. Victoria arranged to send your daughter to me, Heinrich said, his voice gentle but firm. Though I don't think she realized who I was when she did it. I don't understand. Institute Alpenrose, Richard, the school your wife sent Elena to? I'm the director. I'm the one who's been taking care of your daughter for the past 3 weeks. The silence stretched so long, I wondered if my father had hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Elena is with you. She's sitting right here in my office. Would you like to speak with her? Yes, God, yes. Heinrich gestured to me, and I leaned forward toward the phone, my own voice trembling despite my efforts to stay calm. Hi, Dad. Elena, is that really you? It's really me. Are you all right? Are they treating you well? I almost laughed at the question, but I managed to keep my voice steady. I'm fine, Dad. Better than fine, actually. Grandfather has been taking very good care of me. Grandfather? My father's voice cracked on the word. Elena, I don't understand what's happening here. Heinrich leaned forward toward the phone. Richard, we need to talk, all three of us. There are things you need to know about what's been happening in your home. Things about Victoria that Elena has told me. What kinds of things? I took a deep breath and jumped in. Dad, Victoria has been lying to you. About me, about why I needed to be sent away, about everything. She's been manipulating you for years, and sending me here was just the final step in getting me out of the picture permanently. That's ridiculous, my father said, but his voice lacked conviction. Victoria loves you. She's been trying to help you. Has she, Dad? Really? When was the last time you and I had a conversation without her there? When was the last time you saw any of Mom's things around the house? When was the last time you made a decision about me without checking with Victoria first? Another long silence. Victoria says you've been having problems. Acting out, getting into trouble at school. She says you need professional help. What problems specifically? I asked. What have I actually done that was so terrible you needed to send me to another continent? You've been difficult, moody. Victoria says you've been hostile toward her, refusing to accept her as part of the family. Dad, have you ever asked yourself why I might be hostile towards someone who threw away all of Mom's things and convinced you I was crazy? She didn't throw away your mother's things, my father protested, but again his voice was uncertain. Where are they then? Where's Mom's jewelry, her books, the photo albums from when I was little? Where's the piano she used to play? I could hear my father's breathing getting heavier, and I knew I was hitting home. Victoria said, she said we needed to move forward, that keeping those things was preventing us from healing. She said that, I agreed. But did you agree with it? Did you want to get rid of everything that reminded you of Mom? No, he said quietly. No, I didn't want that. Heinrich leaned forward again. Richard, your daughter has been telling me about the past 5 years. About how Victoria has systematically isolated her from you, convinced you that Elena was the problem instead of the solution. Does any of that sound familiar? I don't know, my father said, and I could hear the confusion and pain in his voice. I don't know what to think anymore. Then come here, Heinrich said simply. Come to Switzerland and see for yourself. Talk to your daughter without Victoria there to interpret everything she says. Spend some time with both of us and make up your own mind about what's been happening. I can't just leave, my father protested. I have work, responsibilities. You have a daughter, Heinrich said firmly. Your only child, who has been trying for years to get your attention, to make you see what was happening to your family. Don't you think she deserves a few days of your time? I held my breath, waiting for my father's response. This was the crucial moment. Everything we had planned depended on getting him here, away from Victoria's influence, where he could see the truth for himself. Victoria won't like it, he said finally. Victoria doesn't need to know, Heinrich replied. Tell her you're going on a business trip. Tell her anything you want. But come here, Richard. Come see your daughter. Another long pause, and then, when? As soon as you can arrange it. Tomorrow, if possible. Tomorrow? My father's voice was shocked. I can't possibly. Dad, I interrupted, my voice soft but urgent. Please, I've been gone for 3 weeks, and this is the first time we've talked. Doesn't that tell you something about how things have been arranged? I could hear him thinking, could almost feel the wheels turning in his mind as he began to question assumptions he had been accepting without examination. All right, he said finally. All right, I'll come. But Elena, if what you're saying isn't true? If what I'm saying isn't true, then you can send me back to whatever institution Victoria thinks I belong in, and I won't fight it, I promised. But if it is true, then we need to figure out what we're going to do about it. After we ended the call, Heinrich and I sat in his office for a long time, both of us processing what had just happened. "That went better than I expected?" he said finally. He sounded confused, I replied, but not angry. I was afraid he would just hang up. "He's been living with her manipulation for 5 years," Heinrich pointed out. "It's going to take time for him to sort through what's real and what's been carefully constructed." "How long do we have before Victoria realizes something is wrong?" Heinrich consulted his calendar. "If he leaves tomorrow as planned, she probably won't notice anything until Sunday evening at the earliest. That gives us 2 full days to work with him before she even knows he's gone. And then we'll see what she does when she realizes her carefully constructed world is falling apart." My father arrived in Zurich on Saturday afternoon, looking haggard and uncertain. Heinrich had sent Klaus to pick him up at the airport, and I waited nervously in the director's office for them to return. When my father walked through the door, I was struck by how much older he looked than I remembered. The confident, successful businessman I had grown up admiring had been replaced by someone who seemed tired and beaten down, as if the weight of carrying Victoria's version of reality had worn him out. But when he saw me, something shifted in his expression. For just a moment, I caught a glimpse of the father I remembered from my childhood, the man who had taught me to ride a bike and helped me with my homework and called me his little star. "Elena," he said softly, and then I was in his arms for the first time in months, breathing in the familiar scent of his cologne and feeling like maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be all right. "Hi, Dad," I whispered against his shoulder. When we separated, he turned to look at Heinrich, and I watched as 17 years of estrangement played out across their faces. "Hello, Richard," Heinrich said quietly. "Dad," my father replied, and the single word carried years of pain and regret. They didn't embrace. There was too much history between them for that. But there was something in their acknowledgement of each other that suggested the possibility of healing. Heinrich had arranged for my father to stay in the guest quarters normally reserved for visiting families, a comfortable suite that would give him privacy while keeping him close enough for extended conversations. We spent the first few hours simply catching up, with my father asking questions about my classes, my teachers, my daily routine. It was clear that he had expected to find me in some kind of institutional setting, probably medicated and definitely not thriving. Instead, he found me healthy, happy, and more articulate than I had been in years. "You seem different," he said, as we walked through the school's gardens after dinner. "More like yourself, if that makes sense." "I am more like myself," I replied. "This is what I'm like when I'm not constantly walking on eggshells, trying not to give Victoria another reason to convince you I'm problematic." He winced at that, but he didn't deny it. "She's been very concerned about you," he said carefully. "She says you've been angry and rebellious, refusing to follow rules or accept guidance." "What rules specifically?" I asked. "What have I refused to do?" He was quiet for a moment, clearly thinking. "Well, there was the incident with the college counselor." "You mean when Victoria fired Mrs. Patterson because she suggested I apply to schools Victoria thought were too ambitious for me?" "That's not... Victoria said Mrs. Patterson was encouraging unrealistic expectations." "Dad, Mrs. Patterson thought I should apply to Harvard. My SAT scores were in the 99th percentile. My GPA was 4.2 comma, and I had excellent extracurricular activities. What exactly was unrealistic about suggesting I apply to good schools?" My father stopped walking, a confused expression on his face. "Victoria said your grades had been slipping, that you were barely maintaining a C average." "When? When were my grades ever that low?" "She showed me your report cards." "Did you ever see the actual report cards from school or just the summaries Victoria provided?" I could see the realization dawning in his eyes, the understanding that he had been accepting secondhand information without verification. "Oh God," he said quietly. "Elena, what have I done?" "You trusted someone you thought had our best interests at heart," I said gently. "That's not your fault, Dad. Victoria is very good at what she does." We continued walking in silence for a while, both of us lost in our own thoughts. Finally, my father spoke again. "Tell me about the other things. the things Heinrich mentioned on the phone. And so I did. I told him about coming home from school to find my mother's piano gone, and how Victoria had explained that it was taking up too much space in the living room. I told him about the gradual disappearance of family photos, replaced by new ones featuring Victoria prominently. I told him about the friends I had been forbidden to invite over, because Victoria found them inappropriate, and the activities I had been prevented from joining because they conflicted with Victoria's social schedule. I told him about the college fund that had been moved to more aggressive investments that somehow never seemed to grow, and the jewelry that had been temporarily relocated to a safety deposit box that apparently no longer existed. Most importantly, I told him about the slow, systematic campaign to convince him that I was mentally unstable, dangerous, and in need of professional intervention. "She said you were having violent outbursts," he said when I finished. "She said you had threatened her." "When specifically? Can you remember a specific incident where I threatened her?" He thought for a long time, his brow furrowed in concentration. No, I can't remember specifics. She said it happened when I wasn't home, that you were careful not to do it when I could see." "Dad, in 5 years, can you think of a single time when I was violent or threatening with anyone? At school, with friends, with you?" "No," he admitted quietly. "No, you've never been violent." "Then why did you believe I would be violent with Victoria?" He stopped walking again, leaning against a stone wall that overlooked the valley. "Because I wanted to believe her," he said finally. "Because it was easier than admitting that I was failing as a father, that I was letting someone hurt my daughter in my own home." "Dad, no, let me finish. I knew something was wrong, Elena. Deep down, I knew that the girl Victoria was describing wasn't the daughter I had raised. But acknowledging that would have meant admitting that I had made a terrible mistake, that I had chosen a woman over my own child." He turned to look at me, tears in his eyes. "I was so lonely after your mother died. I felt like I was drowning in grief, and Victoria offered me a way out of that pain. When she started suggesting that you needed help, it felt like she was offering to take care of everything, to handle the parts of parenting that I was failing at." "She was handling them," I said softly. "She was just handling them in a way that served her interests instead of mine. I'm so sorry, Elena. I'm so sorry I let this happen." "I know, Dad. I know you are." We stood there for a while watching the sun set behind the mountains, both of us crying for different reasons. Finally, my father straightened up and wiped his eyes. "What do we do now?" he asked. "How do we fix this?" Before I could answer, Heinrich appeared on the path behind us, his expression grim. "I'm afraid we may not have as much time as we thought," he said. "Victoria just called the school. She knows you're here." My father went pale. "How is that possible? I told her I was going to Chicago on business." "She hired a private investigator to follow you," Heinrich replied, holding up his phone. "Apparently, she's been having you watched for some time now. The investigator followed you to the airport and reported back to her when he saw you board a flight to Zurich." "Oh, God," my father breathed. She's going to think exactly what we want her to think," I interrupted. "That her carefully constructed plan is falling apart and she's losing control of the situation." Heinrich nodded approvingly. "Elena's right. This actually works in our favor. Victoria's about to make some very desperate moves, and desperate people make mistakes." "What kind of moves?" my father asked nervously. "Well," Heinrich said, consulting his phone again. "For starters, she's booked herself on the next flight to Zurich. She'll be here tomorrow morning." I felt a thrill of anticipation mixed with fear. After all these months of careful planning, the final confrontation was about to begin. "Good," I said, surprising both men with my calm tone. "Let her come. It's time she met her match." Victoria arrived at Institute Alpenrose on Sunday morning like an avenging angel, all flowing blonde hair and designer clothes and righteous maternal fury. She swept into Heinrich's office without waiting to be announced, her heels clicking on the wooden floor like gunshots. "Dr. Heinrich," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "I understand my husband is here." "Mrs. Hawthorne," Heinrich replied calmly, rising from his desk. "Yes, Mr. Hawthorne arrived yesterday. He's visiting with his daughter." "His daughter who was sent here for treatment," Victoria snapped. A daughter who has serious behavioral problems and should not be having unsupervised contact with anyone until her therapy is complete. I was sitting in the corner of the office, having insisted on being present for this confrontation, despite Heinrich's concerns about my safety. Victoria's eyes flicked over me dismissively, as if I were a piece of furniture she was considering replacing. "Elena," she said, her voice switching to the false sweetness she used when she wanted to appear concerned. "Darling, you look pale. Have you been taking your medication?" "What medication?" Heinrich asked, his voice sharp. "The medication Dr. Williamson prescribed for her anger management issues," Victoria replied without missing a beat. "Surely that was included in her medical records." "There were no medical records," Heinrich said slowly, "and no mention of any medication." Victoria's composure slipped for just a moment, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. "That's impossible. I specifically requested that all of Elena's psychiatric documentation be forwarded to the school." "Perhaps you could provide Dr. Williamson's contact information?" Heinrich suggested. "I'd like to speak with him about Elena's treatment history." "I'm afraid that's not possible," Victoria said quickly. "Dr. Williamson is no longer practicing. He retired shortly after Elena's last appointment." It was a lie, of course. Dr. Williamson had never existed, just like the medication and the psychiatric documentation. But Victoria was improvising now, trying to maintain control of a situation that was rapidly spiraling away from her. "Where's my husband?" she demanded, changing tactics. "I need to speak with Richard immediately." "He's having breakfast with Elena," Heinrich replied. "They have a lot of catching up to do." "They have nothing to catch up on," Victoria snapped, her mask slipping further. "Richard sees Elena every day at home. This visit is completely unnecessary and potentially harmful to her progress." "When was the last time Richard and Elena had a conversation without you present?" Heinrich asked quietly. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Victoria's eyes narrowed as she realized she was walking into a trap. "I don't monitor their conversations," she said carefully. "But as Elena's primary caregiver, I do try to ensure that their interactions are positive and productive." "Primary caregiver?" Heinrich repeated. "Elena has a father. A father who works 60 hours a week and doesn't have time to deal with a troubled teenager," Victoria shot back. "A father who depends on me to handle the day-to-day challenges of raising a child with serious behavioral issues." "What behavioral issues specifically?" I asked, speaking for the first time since Victoria had entered the room. She turned to look at me, and for a moment I saw her real face. Cold, calculating, and utterly without compassion. "Elena, sweetheart, we've discussed this. Your mood swings, your angry outbursts, your refusal to accept authority." "Can you give me a specific example?" I pressed. "A particular incident where I had a mood swing or an angry outburst?" Victoria's jaw tightened. "There have been so many incidents, darling. It's difficult to choose just one." "Try," Heinrich suggested. For a long moment, Victoria was silent, clearly scrambling to come up with a plausible lie. "There was the incident with the college counselor," she said finally, "when Elena became violent and had to be removed from the meeting." "I was never violent with Mrs. Patterson," I said calmly. "In fact, Mrs. Patterson was very complimentary about my behavior and my academic prospects." "You fired her because she suggested I apply to schools you thought were above my station." "That's not true," Victoria protested, but her voice lacked conviction. "We can contact Mrs. Patterson and ask her directly," Heinrich offered. "I'm sure she would be happy to provide her perspective on Elena's behavior during their meetings." Victoria's face went white, and I knew we had her. "Where is Richard?" she demanded again, this time with desperation creeping into her voice. "I need to speak with my husband now." "I'm right here," my father said from the doorway. We all turned to see him standing in the entrance to Heinrich's office, his face grim and his eyes fixed on Victoria with an expression I had never seen before. "Richard!" Victoria immediately switched back to her concerned wife persona, rushing to his side. "Thank God you're all right. I was so worried when I realized you had come here instead of Chicago." "Were you worried about me?" my father asked quietly. "Or worried about what I might discover?" Victoria's smile faltered. "I don't know what you mean." "I mean that I've spent the last 18 hours talking to my daughter, really talking to her for the first time in years, and I've learned some very interesting things." "Richard, Elena is sick. She needs help, not indulgence. Whatever she's told you, you have to remember that she's not mentally stable. What makes you think she's not mentally stable? My father asked. Can you give me specific examples of unstable behavior? It was the same question I had asked, the same trap Victoria had fallen into before. But this time, with my father asking it, the stakes were much higher. She's been violent, Victoria said desperately. She's threatened me, destroyed property, refused to follow rules. When? My father pressed. When did she threaten you? What property did she destroy? What rules did she refuse to follow? Victoria opened and closed her mouth several times, but no words came out. She had built her entire case against me on vague accusations and emotional manipulation, never expecting to be asked for specifics. You can't answer because it never happened, my father continued, his voice growing stronger. Elena has never been violent, never threatened anyone, never destroyed anything. The only problem she's ever had is that she's been in the way of your plans. That's ridiculous, Victoria protested weakly. Is it? Then explain to me why her college fund has been moved to investments that seem to only lose money. Explain why my daughter's SAT scores were the highest in her class, but you told me she was barely maintaining a C average. Explain why you fired the college counselor who wanted to help her apply to top-tier schools. Victoria was backing toward the door now, her carefully maintained composure completely shattered. You don't understand, she said frantically. Elena has been manipulating you, turning you against me. She's jealous of our marriage, resentful of my place in your life. The only one who's been manipulating anyone is you, my father said, his voice cold with fury. And it's over, Victoria. All of it. Richard, please, Victoria begged, tears streaming down her face. You have to listen to me. I love you. I love Elena. Everything I've done has been for our family. You don't have a family, I said, standing up from my chair. You have victims, but not anymore. Victoria whirled to face me, and for a moment I saw pure hatred in her eyes, the real emotion that had been hiding behind all her false concern and maternal posturing. You little bitch, she snarled. You think you've won? You think you can destroy everything I've built? I think I already have, I replied calmly. Victoria lunged toward me, her manicured nails extended like claws. But Heinrich stepped between us before she could reach me. That's enough, he said firmly. Mrs. Hawthorne, I think it's time for you to leave. I'm not going anywhere without my husband, Victoria said, but the fight was going out of her. She could see the way my father was looking at her, could see that whatever spell she had cast over him was finally broken. Your husband can make his own decisions, Heinrich replied, but you are no longer welcome on these premises. Victoria turned to my father one last time, a desperate plea in her eyes. Richard, please, don't let her destroy us. Don't throw away 5 years of marriage for a child who's been nothing but trouble. The only trouble Elena has ever caused, my father said quietly, is that she reminded me of what I lost when I stopped being her father. But I remember now, Victoria. I remember who I used to be, and I remember who she is, and I choose her. The words hit Victoria like a physical blow. She staggered backward, her face crumpling with rage and defeat. You'll regret this, she said, her voice venomous. Both of you. You think you can just discard me like garbage, but I know things about you, Richard. I have evidence of your business dealings, your personal life. What evidence? Heinrich asked mildly. The evidence my investigators found showing how you've been embezzling from Richard's accounts? The evidence showing your pattern of targeting wealthy widowers? The evidence showing how you've been planning Elena's removal from the family since the day you married her father? Victoria went white as she realized that we had been several steps ahead of her all along. You've been investigating me. Thoroughly, Heinrich confirmed. And what we found makes for very interesting reading. I'm sure the authorities would be fascinated by your creative approach to financial management. Victoria looked around the room like a trapped animal, seeing enemies everywhere and no way out. This isn't over, she said finally. You can't prove anything. Actually, we can, I said, pulling out a small digital recorder I had been carrying. Including the part where you just called me a little bitch and admitted that you've been manipulating my father. Not very maternal, Victoria. The blood drained from Victoria's face as she realized she had been recorded confessing to her true feelings about me. That's illegal, she whispered. Actually, it's not, Heinrich replied. Swiss recording laws are quite clear on the matter. But even if it were illegal, I don't think a recording would be necessary. Your behavior here today has been witnessed by 3 people, and I'm quite sure a jury would find our testimony very compelling. Victoria stood frozen for a moment, her mind clearly racing as she tried to find some way out of the trap she had walked into. Finally, she turned and ran from the office, her heels clicking frantically on the wooden floor as she fled. We listened to her footsteps fade away, followed by the sound of a car engine starting and tires squealing on gravel as she left the school grounds. Well, Heinrich said mildly, settling back into his chair. That went better than expected. My father was staring at the door Victoria had just fled through, his face a mixture of relief and disbelief. 5 years, he said quietly. 5 years I let her convince me that my own daughter was the enemy. She's very good at what she does, I said gently. You're not the first person she's fooled, and you probably won't be the last. But I'm supposed to be her father, he said, turning to look at me with tears in his eyes. I'm supposed to protect you, not deliver you to someone who wants to hurt you. You did protect me, I pointed out. By bringing me here, you delivered me to the one person who could help me fight back. Maybe you didn't know that's what you were doing, but it worked out the same way. Heinrich cleared his throat. There are still some practical matters we need to address. Victoria will undoubtedly try to cause problems when you return home, Richard. She still has access to your accounts, your house, your personal informations. What do you suggest? My father asked. Damage control, Heinrich replied. Change all your passwords, contact your bank and investment advisors, secure any valuable items she might try to take. Most importantly, file for divorce immediately and make sure she can't claim any of Elena's inheritance. She won't go quietly, I warned. Victoria doesn't accept defeat gracefully. Then we'll have to be prepared for whatever she throws at us, my father said, his voice stronger than I had heard it in years. But we'll face it together this time. Both of us. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal and financial activity. Heinrich's investigators had provided us with enough evidence to not only file for divorce, but also to press criminal charges for embezzlement and fraud. Victoria's carefully constructed life began unraveling with astonishing speed. She tried to fight back, of course. She hired an expensive lawyer and attempted to paint herself as the victim of an elaborate conspiracy between my father and me. She claimed that I had manipulated both men, that Heinrich was using his wealth and influence to destroy an innocent woman who had only tried to help a troubled family. But the evidence against her was overwhelming. Financial records, recordings, witness statements from the private investigators. It all painted a clear picture of a woman who had systematically destroyed a family for her own gain. The criminal trial made headlines in the international press, partly because of Heinrich's prominence in Swiss society, and partly because Victoria's story was so dramatic. American stepmother sentenced in Swiss fraud case, read one headline. Gold digger's elaborate con exposed by granddaughter, read another. Victoria was sentenced to 4 years in a Swiss prison, followed by deportation back to the United States, where she faced additional charges. Her assets were frozen and eventually distributed to her victims, including the repayment of everything she had stolen from my father. But more importantly than the legal victory was the personal healing that began during those weeks in Switzerland. My father and Heinrich slowly began to rebuild their relationship, working through 17 years of hurt and misunderstanding. They would never be as close as they had been before their falling out, but they found a way to be family again. And my father and I rediscovered each other as well. Away from Victoria's influence, he began to remember who he had been before grief and loneliness had made him vulnerable to her manipulation. He apologized countless times for the years he had failed me, but I was more interested in moving forward than dwelling on the past. I want to come home, I told him one evening as we walked through the school gardens. But not to the house where Victoria was. I want us to start fresh somewhere new. Whatever you want, he said immediately. We can move anywhere you'd like, buy a new house, start completely over. What about work? Your business is in Boston. My business can be managed from anywhere with an internet connection, he replied. And frankly, after 5 years of Victoria's influence on my decision-making, it might be good to have some physical distance while I sort out which deals were legitimate and which ones were designed to benefit her. We decided to move to San Francisco, partly because it was as far from Boston as we could get while still staying in the United States, and partly because my father had always talked about wanting to live on the West Coast. He bought a beautiful house in Pacific Heights with a view of the bay, and we spent months furnishing it together, choosing every piece with care. For the first time since my mother's death, I felt like I had a real home again. I finished my senior year at Institute Alpenrose partly because I was genuinely enjoying the experience, and partly because it gave my father time to arrange our new life in California. Heinrich had become not just my grandfather, but my mentor, teaching me about business and finance and the importance of using wealth and influence responsibly. "You have a gift for seeing through people's facades," he told me one day as we reviewed some business proposals together. "That's a valuable skill in any field, but especially in business. People will try to manipulate you because of your wealth and your family connections, but you'll be able to see them coming from a mile away." "I had a good teacher," I replied, thinking about Victoria and all the lessons she had unknowingly provided about the nature of deception. When graduation day arrived, both my father and Heinrich were there to watch me receive my diploma. It was a small ceremony with only about 30 students in my class, but it felt like the most important achievement of my life, not because of the academic accomplishment, but because of what it represented. I had survived Victoria's attempt to destroy me. I had reclaimed my relationship with my father. I had gained a grandfather who loved and supported me. And most importantly, I had learned that I was stronger than I had ever imagined. The only shadow on the day was knowing that in my first life, this was around the time I had died in that mountain hospital, alone and forgotten. But instead of dwelling on that alternate reality, I chose to focus on the life I was living now. After graduation, my father and I flew to San Francisco to begin our new life together. Heinrich had given me a generous graduation gift, not money, but something much more valuable. He had arranged for me to intern at one of his investment firms during my gap year before college, giving me real-world experience in business and finance. "Consider it your education in the family business," he had said with a smile. "Someone needs to carry on the Hawthorne legacy of helping people who can't help themselves." Our new house in San Francisco was everything the old one in Boston hadn't been: bright, welcoming, and filled with memories we were creating together rather than ghosts from the past. My father had kept only a few pieces from our old life, mostly photos of my mother and some books that had belonged to her. Everything else was new, chosen specifically for our fresh start. One of the first things we did was set up a music room with a beautiful Steinway grand piano, not a replacement for my mother's instrument, but a tribute to her memory and a promise that music would once again be part of our family's life. I had been taking lessons at Institute Alpenrose and discovered that I had inherited my mother's talent, though I had never been allowed to develop it under Victoria's regime. The internship at Heinrich's investment firm turned out to be exactly what I needed. Working with experienced financial advisors and portfolio managers, I learned not just about money management, but about the psychology of wealth, how it could corrupt people like Victoria, but also how it could be used to create positive change in the world. My supervisor was a woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, a brilliant economist who had left a high-paying job on Wall Street to work for Heinrich because she believed in his philosophy of ethical investing. "Your grandfather doesn't just make money," she explained during my first week. "He makes money work for good. Every investment, every business deal, every financial decision is evaluated not just on its potential return, but on its impact on society." It was a revelation to understand that wealth could be a tool for justice rather than just accumulation. Under Dr. Chen's guidance, I began to see how the skills I had developed in exposing Victoria's deception could be applied to identifying fraudulent investment schemes, predatory lending practices, and other financial crimes that targeted vulnerable people. "You have an unusual ability to see patterns that others miss," Dr. Chen told me after I'd identified several red flags in a proposed investment deal. "That's partly natural talent, but it's also the result of having been victimized yourself. You know what predatory behavior looks like because you've lived through it." As the months passed, I threw myself into my work with a passion that surprised everyone, including myself. But more than the professional development, I treasured the rebuilding of my relationship with my father. We had dinner together every night, talking about everything from current events to our plans for the future. We took weekend trips to explore California, visited museums and galleries, and slowly created new traditions to replace the ones Victoria had destroyed. One evening in March, almost a year after Victoria's sentencing, my father brought up a subject we had been carefully avoiding. "Have you thought about college?" he asked as we sat on our terrace watching the sunset over the bay. "I know Heinrich's internship has been valuable, but you're too smart to skip higher education entirely." I had been thinking about it, actually. In my first life, I had dreamed of attending Harvard or Stanford, studying business and economics with the goal of eventually working in finance. But Victoria had convinced my father that such ambitions were unrealistic for someone with my problems. "I've been accepted to Stanford," I said quietly. "Dr. Chen helped me with my application, and Heinrich wrote a recommendation letter. I start in the fall." My father's face lit up with pride and joy. "Elena, that's wonderful. Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "Because I wanted to make sure I was doing it for the right reasons," I replied. "In my old life, before Victoria, I wanted to go to college because it was expected, because it was the next step in a plan that someone else had made for me. This time, I want to go because I have something specific I want to accomplish." Which is? I turned to look at him, seeing the genuine interest and support in his eyes. The same expression I remembered from my childhood, before grief and manipulation had dulled his emotional connection to me. "I want to study business and law with a focus on financial crime investigation. I want to help other people who have been victimized the way we were, families who have been torn apart by people like Victoria." My father was quiet for a moment, processing what I had said. "That's a noble goal," he said finally. "But are you sure you want to build your career around revisiting that kind of trauma?" "I'm not revisiting it," I corrected. "I'm transforming it. Victoria tried to destroy our family, but instead she gave me the skills and motivation to prevent the same thing from happening to others. That's not trauma, that's purpose." He smiled and reached over to squeeze my hand. "Your mother would be so proud of you. She always said you had the strongest moral compass of anyone she knew." "I learned it from watching both of you," I replied. "Before Victoria, I mean. You and Mom taught me what real love and loyalty looked like, even if I lost sight of it for a while." We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the lights begin to twinkle across the city. "There's something else," I said eventually. "Heinrich has offered to fund a foundation focused on protecting children from family financial abuse. He wants me to run it after I graduate from college." "That's an enormous responsibility," my father said, but his tone was admiring rather than concerned. "I know, but I also know that there are other Elenas out there, kids whose trust funds are being raided, whose futures are being stolen by people who are supposed to protect them. If I can help even a few of them, then everything we went through will have been worth it." My father stood up and walked to the edge of the terrace, looking out over the water. "I keep thinking about how close we came to losing each other completely," he said. "If Heinrich hadn't been there, if Victoria had succeeded in cutting all your family connections." "But she didn't succeed," I pointed out. "Her greatest mistake was thinking she could erase our family's history. She underestimated the power of blood connections and the lengths that people will go to protect the ones they love. Even when they don't realize they're being manipulated, especially then. Heinrich spent 17 years waiting for a chance to reconnect with you. I spent 5 years trying to hold on to our relationship despite Victoria's interference. Love doesn't just disappear because someone tries to manipulate it away." My father turned back to me, tears in his eyes. I should have protected you better. I should have seen what she was doing." "Dad, we've been through this. Victoria was a professional. She made a career out of fooling intelligent, successful people. You're not the first person to fall for her act, and unfortunately, you probably won't be the last. But I'm supposed to be your father. You are my father. Not because you never made mistakes, but because when it mattered most, you chose me over her. That's what counts." We ended up talking until nearly midnight, processing years of pain and confusion, and slowly building the foundation for a stronger relationship than we had ever had before. It was one of many such conversations we would have over the following months, each one bringing us closer to understanding how we had nearly lost each other and how we could make sure it never happened again. Stanford University in the fall of 2023 was everything I had hoped it would be and more. The campus was beautiful, the professors were brilliant, and the student body was diverse and intellectually challenging. But more than the academic experience, I treasured the freedom to simply be a normal college student, something I had never expected to have after the trauma of my first life. I threw myself into my studies with the intensity of someone who truly appreciated the opportunity for education. My professors were impressed by my maturity and focus, though they attributed it to good parenting rather than the reality of having lived through experiences that had aged me beyond my years. My double major in business and criminology kept me busy, but I also found time for extracurricular activities. I joined the debate team, volunteered at a legal aid clinic that helped low-income families with financial disputes, and even tried out for the crew team, something I had always wanted to do but had never been allowed to pursue under Victoria's regime. But perhaps most importantly, I began building friendships with people who knew nothing about my past except what I chose to share with them. My roommate, Jessica, was a pre-med student from Oregon who became the sister I had never had. My study group included students from around the world, each with their own stories of overcoming challenges to reach Stanford. For the first time in years, I felt like I belonged somewhere. Heinrich visited often, usually combining business trips to California with family time. He and my father had developed a tentative but growing friendship, bonding over their shared commitment to my happiness and their mutual regret over the years they had lost to misunderstanding. "You know," Heinrich said during one of his visits, as we walked across the Stanford campus together, "seeing you here, thriving like this, makes me believe that sometimes the worst things that happen to us lead to the best outcomes." "How do you mean?" I asked. "If Victoria had never come into your lives, you and your father might never have reconnected with me. You might never have discovered your talent for financial investigation. You might never have developed the passion for helping others that drives you now. Are you saying I should be grateful to Victoria?" Heinrich laughed. "Absolutely not. I'm saying that you took the worst possible situation and transformed it into something powerful and positive. That's not luck or fate. That's character." We paused beside the fountain in the center of campus, watching other students hurry between classes. "I've been thinking about the foundation," Heinrich continued, "about how we want to structure it, what services we want to provide, how we can have the greatest impact. And I think we should start with a hotline, a place where children and teenagers can call when they suspect financial abuse in their families. Most kids don't even know what to look for, let alone what to do about it." It was a brilliant idea and one that could have prevented my own situation if it had existed 5 years earlier. "We could also provide legal assistance," I suggested. "A lot of families can't afford to fight back against financial manipulation, especially when the abuser controls the family resources." "Exactly. And educational programs for schools and social workers, helping them recognize the signs of financial abuse before it gets too advanced." We spent the rest of his visit developing the framework for what would eventually become the Hawthorne Foundation for Family Financial Protection. By the time Heinrich returned to Switzerland, we had outlined a comprehensive program that would provide education, intervention, and legal support for families dealing with financial manipulation. The foundation officially launched during my junior year at Stanford, with Heinrich providing the initial funding and me serving as a student advisor while I completed my education. Our first major case involved a situation remarkably similar to my own: a widowed father whose new wife was systematically stealing from his teenage daughter's trust fund. Working with our legal team to expose the theft and restore the stolen money felt like the completion of a circle that had begun in Heinrich's office 2 years earlier. The gratitude in the father's eyes when he realized how close he had come to losing his relationship with his daughter reminded me powerfully of my own father's expression when he finally understood what Victoria had been doing to our family. "Every family we help is a victory over people like Victoria," I told my father during one of our weekly phone calls. "Every child we protect is a step toward making sure that what happened to us never happens to anyone else." "I'm so proud of you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not just for your academic success or your work with the foundation, but for the person you've become. You took something that could have destroyed you and turned it into a force for good." "I had good teachers," I replied, "both in what to do and what not to do." My senior year at Stanford flew by in a blur of thesis research, job interviews, and foundation work. I had been accepted to law school at Harvard, a dream I had carried since high school. But I had also received an offer to join Heinrich's investment firm full-time after graduation. The decision was surprisingly easy. While law school would always be there, the opportunity to work directly with Heinrich and expand the foundation's reach was time-sensitive. He was 75 years old and eager to pass on his knowledge and resources to the next generation. I can always go to law school later, I told my father, as we prepared for my graduation ceremony. But I can't get back the years I might have with Heinrich if I wait too long. That's very wise, he agreed. And honestly, the practical experience you'll get working with him will be just as valuable as any law degree. Graduation day was everything I had dreamed it would be. Warm sunshine, proud family members, and the satisfaction of knowing I had earned every honor through my own hard work. Heinrich and my father sat together in the audience, two men who had overcome their own painful history to unite in supporting my future. During the ceremony, as I walked across the stage to receive my diploma, I thought about the girl I had been in my first life, broken, defeated, and dying alone in a Swiss hospital. That Elena had believed she was powerless, that she was trapped by circumstances beyond her control. This Elena knew better. This Elena understood that power wasn't something you were born with or given by others. It was something you created through knowledge, preparation, and the willingness to fight for what was right. As I shook hands with the university president and accepted my diploma, I silently promised that first Elena that her sacrifice had not been in vain. Every person we helped through the foundation, every family we protected from financial predators, every child we saved from manipulation and abuse would be a testament to her memory and a victory over everyone who had ever tried to convince us we were powerless. The reception after graduation was filled with friends, family, and professors who had shaped my college experience. But the moment I treasured most came when Heinrich and my father found me near the end of the evening. "Elena," Heinrich said, his voice formal but his eyes warm with pride. "Your father and I have something we want to discuss with you." I looked between them, seeing matching expressions of excitement and anticipation. "What is it?" "Well," my father said, "Heinrich and I have been talking about the foundation, about its future and its potential for growth. And we've decided," Heinrich continued, "that it's time to make it truly independent. Not just a project of my investment firm, but a standalone organization with its own board, its own resources, and its own mission. We want you to be the founding director," my father said, "not an assistant or an advisor, but the person who shapes its vision and leads its development." I felt tears prick at my eyes as I realized what they were offering me. Not just a job, but a chance to build something meaningful from the ground up. "The initial endowment will be $50 million, Heinrich added casually, as if that weren't a life-changing amount of money. "Enough to establish offices in major cities, hire a full staff, and really make a difference in people's lives." I started, then stopped, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they were proposing. "You don't have to answer now," my father said gently. "Take some time to think about it. Consider whether this is really what you want to do with your life." "I don't need time to think about it," I replied, finding my voice again. "This is exactly what I want to do with my life. This is why I survived everything Victoria put me through, so I could help others survive it too." Heinrich smiled and pulled out a thick folder from his briefcase. "In that case," he said, "we have a lot of work to do." The months following graduation were a whirlwind of activity as we transformed the Hawthorne Foundation from a small charitable project into a major nonprofit organization. We established headquarters in San Francisco, with satellite offices planned for New York, Chicago, and eventually London and Zurich. Hiring staff was both challenging and rewarding. We needed people who combined professional expertise with genuine compassion for victims of financial abuse. Our legal team included prosecutors who specialized in white-collar crime, our counseling staff included therapists who understood family trauma, and our investigative team included former FBI agents who knew how to trace hidden assets. But perhaps most importantly, we hired other survivors, people who had lived through financial manipulation and understood firsthand what our clients were experiencing. Their insights and empathy, proved invaluable in designing programs that actually met the needs of vulnerable families. Our first major public case came just 6 months after the Foundation's official launch. A prominent businessman in Los Angeles was accused of systematically draining his children's trust funds to support his gambling addiction, while his new wife helped cover up the theft. The children's mother had died in a car accident 2 years earlier, leaving them with substantial inheritances that had been slowly disappearing ever since. The case had everything: grieving children, a manipulative step-parent, missing money, and a father who had been compromised by addiction and poor judgment. It was like looking into a funhouse mirror of my own experience, with variations that made it both familiar and uniquely challenging. Working with the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office, we were able to trace the missing funds and expose the elaborate scheme that had been used to hide the theft. More importantly, we were able to reunite the children with extended family members who could provide the stability and protection they needed. The media coverage of the case was extensive, partly because of the amounts of money involved, but mostly because it highlighted a type of crime that had previously received little attention. Suddenly, everyone was talking about financial abuse within families, and our phones began ringing with calls from around the country. "We've hit a nerve," Dr. Chen observed during one of our staff meetings. "People are realizing that this isn't just about money. It's about trust, family, and the most fundamental relationships in our lives. Now, it's also about power," I added. "Financial abusers count on their victims feeling helpless and isolated. When we show families that they have options, that there are people who will believe them and fight for them, we're taking away the abuser's most powerful weapon." As word spread about our work, we began receiving invitations to speak at conferences, consult with law enforcement agencies, and advise legislators about laws that could better protect children from financial exploitation. I found myself testifying before Congress about the need for stronger oversight of trust funds and guardianship arrangements. The current system, I told the House Subcommittee on Consumer Protection, essentially operates on the honor system. We assume that parents and guardians will always act in the best interests of the children they're supposed to protect. But as my own case and hundreds of others demonstrate, that assumption is tragically flawed. The work was challenging and often heartbreaking, but it was also deeply fulfilling. Every family we helped, every child we protected, every abuser we exposed felt like a victory, not just for them, but for everyone who had ever been victimized by someone they trusted. My father had moved his business headquarters to San Francisco so he could be closer to the Foundation's work and to me. He served on our board of directors and often helped with cases that involved complex business transactions or hidden assets. "You know," he said one evening as we reviewed case files together, "sometimes I wonder what Victoria would think if she could see us now." "She'd probably be furious that her attempt to destroy us actually made us stronger," I replied. "But honestly, I don't think about her much anymore. She's part of our past, not our future." Do you ever worry that this work is keeping you trapped in that past? That you're defining yourself by what happened to you rather than moving beyond it? It was a fair question, and one I had asked myself many times. "I think there's a difference between being trapped by your past and being informed by it," I said, after considering his words. "Victoria tried to make me a victim, but I chose to become a protector instead. That's not about staying stuck, that's about transformation." Heinrich, now 77 but still sharp and energetic, had become more than just my grandfather and mentor. He had become my closest collaborator in building something that could outlast all of us. "When I'm gone," he said during one of our strategic planning sessions, "I want to know that the work will continue, not because someone has to, but because someone wants to. Because someone understands that protecting families is about more than money, it's about preserving the bonds that make us human." "The work will continue," I promised him. "But you're not going anywhere for a long time yet. We still have too much to accomplish." He smiled at that, the same expression I had seen on his face the day we first met in his office at Institute Alpenrose. "Do you remember what I told you that first day?" he asked. "About how sometimes the worst things that happen to us lead to the best outcomes?" "I remember. I want you to know that I believe that more strongly than ever. Victoria thought she was destroying you, isolating you, making you powerless. Instead, she delivered you into the hands of people who could help you become exactly who you were meant to be." I thought about that conversation for a long time afterward, about the strange alchemy that had transformed betrayal into purpose, isolation into connection, powerlessness into strength. 5 years after Victoria's sentencing, I received a letter forwarded through the Foundation's attorneys. It was from Victoria herself, writing from the federal prison where she was serving the remainder of her sentence after being deported from Switzerland. The letter was exactly what I would have expected, a mixture of self-pity, denial, and veiled threats. She claimed that she had been wrongfully convicted, that I had manipulated both my father and Heinrich against her, that the evidence against her had been fabricated. But buried in the rambling text was something that caught my attention. You think you've won, but you don't understand the game we're really playing. There are others like me, others who know how to spot weakness and exploit it. You can't save everyone, Elena, and someday, someone will do to you what you did to me. I shared the letter with my father and Heinrich, partly to keep them informed, but mostly to get their perspective on whether Victoria still posed any kind of threat. She's trying to get into your head, my father said after reading it. She wants you to feel afraid, to doubt yourself and your work. Do you, Heinrich asked, feel afraid? I considered the question carefully. Did I fear that Victoria or someone like her might target me someday? Did I worry that my success in exposing her had made me a target for other predators? No, I said finally. I'm not afraid. Because I'm not the same person I was when Victoria first tried to destroy me. I'm not isolated, I'm not powerless, and I'm definitely not naive about how people like her operate. Besides, I added with a smile, I have something Victoria never counted on. A family that actually loves me and resources to fight back. Anyone who tries to manipulate me the way she manipulated my father is going to find themselves facing a very different opponent than they expected. Heinrich nodded approvingly. That's exactly the right attitude. Victoria's biggest mistake was underestimating you. Anyone else who makes the same mistake will face the same consequences. I folded the letter and put it away, filing it with the other documents from Victoria's case. It would serve as a reminder, but not of fear, of how far we had all come from the broken family she had tried to create. The Foundation's work continued to expand and evolve. We developed educational programs for high schools and colleges, teaching young people how to recognize and respond to financial manipulation. We created training materials for social workers and family court judges, helping them identify signs of financial abuse that had previously gone unnoticed. Most importantly, we built a network of survivors who could support each other and share their experiences. The isolation that predators like Victoria counted on became impossible when victims had access to a community of people who understood exactly what they were going through. On the 10th anniversary of my mother's death, my father and I visited her grave together for the first time since Victoria had convinced him it was too painful and counterproductive to healing. We brought flowers and photos of our new life, wanting to share with her memory the happiness we had rebuilt. She would have been so proud of you, my father said as we stood beside her headstone. Not just for your success, but for your compassion. She always said that the measure of a person wasn't what they achieved, but how they used their achievements to help others. I learned that from both of you, I replied. Even during the worst of it with Victoria, I always carried your values with me. They just got buried for a while under all the manipulation and pain. Do you think you'll ever forgive me? He asked quietly. For choosing Victoria over you? For almost losing you completely? I turned to look at him, seeing the genuine remorse and regret in his eyes. Dad, I forgave you a long time ago. The person who sent me away wasn't really you. It was who you became under Victoria's influence. The real you is the person who flew to Switzerland the moment you realized I needed you, who chose me over her when it mattered most. I just wish I had seen through her sooner. If you had, we might never have found Heinrich again. We might never have started the Foundation. We might never have learned how strong our family really is when we're fighting for each other instead of against each other. We stood in comfortable silence for a while, both of us thinking about the woman whose love had shaped us both, and whose memory had ultimately saved us from Victoria's deception. You know what I think Mom would say if she could see us now? I asked finally. What? She'd say that love always wins in the end, but sometimes it takes a while to figure out what the victory looks like. As we walked back to the car together, I thought about the strange journey that had brought us to this point. Victoria had intended to destroy our family, to erase me from my father's life and claim everything that belonged to us. Instead, she had given us something we might never have found otherwise. The knowledge that our love for each other was stronger than any manipulation, more enduring than any deception. The girl who had died alone in a Swiss hospital had been powerless because she believed she was alone. The woman I had become understood that she was never truly alone, as long as she was fighting for something bigger than herself. Every family we helped, every predator we exposed, every child we protected was proof that Victoria's attempt to destroy us had failed completely. We were not just survivors, we were warriors using our own experience of victimization to prevent others from suffering the same fate. And in the end, that was the greatest revenge of all, transforming our pain into purpose, our trauma into triumph, our darkest moment into a beacon of hope for others who were still struggling in the darkness. Victoria had tried to write the ending to our story, but she had failed to understand the most important thing about the Hawthorne family. We didn't give up on each other, and we never stopped fighting for what was right. The story she had tried to write ended with my destruction and my father's isolation. The story we chose to write instead ended with healing, justice, and the promise that no other family would have to face what we had faced alone. It was, I realized, exactly the ending my mother would have wanted for us, and it was exactly the beginning Victoria had never seen coming.